Hello, hello. Can everyone hear me okay? Hello, hello. Yeah, all right. How's it going, Stuart? Just making sure everything is working. Here so. Give it a second, let a few other people jump in. All right, all right. Let's get started here. Feels like everything's working. So, welcome everyone. Thanks for jumping in. And start off, please ask questions. I got the chat open here to my right. And so I encourage ask questions, all that. What kind of levels of poker do we have here in the chat? So we're going to be talking about preflop poker today. My favorite street in all of poker. Um, very, very vast topic. I think a lot of people don't put a lot of time into preflop. So let's get started. First off, why is preflop the most important street in poker, in my opinion? Preflop, I think, is the most important street in poker because it happens the most frequently. Every single hand goes to preflop. A lot of people might say the river. Um, the river, it's really important. However, not many hands get to the river. The turn, not many hands get to the turn. The flop, not all hands get to the flop. Every hand gets preflop. Every single hand. You make a preflop decision every single hand. And preflop, I think, is the most important street of poker because of that. Other reasons why preflop, I think, is the most important, and a lot of people don't think about preflop this way. So, how do you play postflop without knowing preflop? So, in my opinion, the best way to learn how to play postflop very well is by understanding your preflop ranges in and out. So, for example, if you know you raise from the button and you're raising with offsuit nines are better and suited sixes are better, well, when the flop contains like a nine or higher, hands that connect with your range, you can bet more often. Knowing where the bottom of your ranges are, what are your weakest hands in your range that don't have a pair now? How do you know what hands that you have in your range to bluff on the river? How do you know what hands pre-flop connect with your ranges? Pre-flop leads to everything in poker, in my opinion. And in order to play better post-flop, you got to know pre-flop a lot better. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. Pre-flop charts, they're a guide. You don't want to copy. We're going to talk a little bit about how to memorize pre-flop charts, some pre-flop mechanics, how things work a little bit. You don't really want to copy pre-flop. You want to implement them. And so learning how things work pre-flop, the mechanics of pre-flop, really will help you develop like pre-flop ranges in person a lot better, rather than just trying to blindly copy what the ranges are saying if you're looking at pre-flop ranges online. Um, so, question. So it seems like we have a few cash game players, few tournament players. We're going to be talking a little bit of everything today pre-flop. So I'm going to take away the answer. But if I ask you this, and I want some crowd participation here, people in the chat. If I say it folds to you on the button, you're playing a tournament, you have 40 big blinds, what are you raising with? Okay? How are you telling that to me? How do you know what you're raising with there? Do you have a framework? Do you have a mechanic? Do you have some type of easy way to quickly know what hands to raise and what hands to fold? 40 big blinds, it folds to you on the button in a tournament. Do you have an easy mechanic, or how do you go about choosing your pre-flop opens? So, the easy way to do it is just you want to memorize the bottom of the ranges. You don't need to memorize this whole complicated range here. You look on the bottom right here, 54% of hands is a lot of hands. You're not going to remember every hand. You don't need to remember any hand. You just need to remember the bottoms. And how we remember this range is offsuit sevens and suited fives. You're going to raise every single suited five or better. You could even say suited fours is a pretty good thing. You can just simplify here. If you raise 9-4 and 8-4 suited, it's not going to be a big issue. Suited fours, offsuit eights. Not that hard to figure out. You're going to raise more offsuit aces. You're going to raise a few more offsuit kings. This is more difficult. But if you memorize the bottoms, suited fives, offsuit eights, you want to remember the offsuit floors and the suited floors. That's what makes this a lot easier. Remember the floors of your range, and that's going to help you a lot. From the cutoff, for example, I don't have the range here. From the cutoff, it's offsuit nines and suited sixes. From the hijack, it's going to be offsuit tens and suited sevens. It's much easier to understand how your preflop range is when you just start to learn the floors. This becomes, that's all the memorization you have to do. Anyone can do it. It's not some highly intellectual, you don't have to be like a rock star or like a scientist or anything to figure this out. You just need to remember the bottom. What's the bottom of your offsuit range? What's the bottom of your suited range? And how does this memorization, how does it help you post flop? Well, here you have all the offsuit eights, right? Offsuit combos are what are most important in poker. Offsuit eights. So if the flop contains 3 cards above an 8, you're going to connect pretty well with that flop and probably be betting a lot because you don't miss because you have coverage of all the pairs. When the flop comes 6-4 deuce, for example, on 6-4 deuce, well, I raise with offsuit eights. The flop comes 6-4 deuce. Well, I missed this flop a lot. It's not that great of a flop, and we're going to be checking a lot now because we have too much air in our range. So once you understand pre-flop, which is what this webinar is about, it really helps and really makes it a lot easier to play post-flop when you know your pre-flop ranges much better. So remember the floors of your pre-flop ranges by your offsuit hands and your suited hand. What's the weakest suited hand you want to raise? What's the offsuit hands? Weakest offsuit hands you want to raise. So in the chat here, we have some cash game players. We have some tournament players. How to adjust to antes when you're raised first inning. Okay, when you're the first enter in the pot, how do you want to adjust to antes? So in cash games versus tournaments, there's 2 main differences. Okay, rake and antes. Okay, rake and antes, and both of these are going to either constrict or expand our preflop ranges. So with rake, if there's rake involved, meaning money comes out of the pot post-flop, that means less hands are profitable to raise, and we need to play tighter because we need a much more profitable hand. Think about it as I often compare in tournament poker ICM, or when there's a risk premium. You say you're at a final table 5 or 6 handed. Most people understand how it's expensive to bust out, so you play a little bit tighter. Well, it's the same thing it works the same way as rake in a cash game. When there's rake involved and they're taking money out of the pot, that makes it a little bit harder to play more hands. Therefore, you got to play a bit tighter because of that. Okay? So is there rake involved? Most of the time that has to deal with live cash games, low stake live cash games. They're taking $5 out. Say you're playing 1-2, you make it $10. They call $10. There's $20 in the pot. They take $3 out of the pot, let's say. That's 15% of the pot is gone. And that makes a lot of the bottom opens not very profitable to open because you can't win the whole pot now. You can only win 85% of the pot. So rake, you have to play a lot tighter. Antes also make a huge difference. Why do antes make a huge difference? Well, when there's antes involved, you're getting a better price to start to steal the blinds and steal the antes. And that's what poker is all about. You want to, stealing, winning money without showdowns, not having to turn your cards face up. That's a huge part of poker. And when there's antes involved, you get to play more hands. And you get to therefore raise much wider than you do in a cash game with no antes. So you end up with much tighter ranges in cash games. In cash games, you have to play much tighter preflop because you have rake and you have no ante. There a lot of times when I'm doing webinars, I'm a tournament specialist, but I do play a lot of cash. People ask, "Oh, does this apply to my cash games? I play cash games. I don't play tournaments. Does this concept you're talking about apply?" Yes, it's no limit hold'em. All the concepts are the exact same. All that changes are the ranges. The ranges are what change. And if you're playing a cash game, let's say 5-10 no limit, and it's a time game, meaning every half hour you pay time instead of they don't take any money out of the pot. And sometimes you play with an ante. Maybe it's 5-10, and every time the button puts in $10 for the ante. That is going to play the exact same way as a tournament with similar stacked up. So if you play with 100 big blinds in that format versus 100 big blinds in a tournament, it's going to play the same. All that matters here is how rake and ante affects the preflop ranges. So cash games much tighter because of the rakes and because of the antes. And this is like a button raise first in range in a cash game. You see it's only 43%. That range before in the tournament, we were looking at 54% on the button versus here we're looking at 43%. So we're about 14% tighter, almost 25% tighter in the cash game setting because of the rake and because of the ante, both of those. Another thing is, how do we want to adjust the stacked ups for our raise first in range, 100 big blinds versus 40 big blinds? So in tournaments, you're often playing with like 40 big blinds, 50 big blinds, 30 big blinds, versus in cash games, you're playing with 100 big blinds. What type of adjustments do we want to make in those situations? Anyone in the chat? So when we're raising 100 big blinds, connectivity and being able to make a straight and suitedness becomes a lot more powerful. So hands like 8-6 suited, 9-6 suited, 7-5 suited, even like King 4 suited, go way up at 100 big blinds because you have hands that can make straights and flushes. So the bigger the stack depth, the more important it is to make straights and make flushes. Okay, you want to be able to make really strong hands and flop strong draws. Think of it, a good way to think about it is the deeper you are, the more you want to be able to flop a straight flush draw. Okay, the deeper you are, the more you want to be able to flop a straight flush draw. That's a really good indicator. Or flop a nut flush draw. Okay, when you have 30 big blinds or 40 big blinds, what's more important? Being able to flop a straight flush draw or being able to flop top pair? What's more important at 40 big blinds or 30 big blinds? Top pair or straight flush draws? So the shallower you get, the more top pair is more important. So being able to flop top pair, which is more common when you have high cards. So hands like King 10 offsuit go way up in value. Queen 10 offsuit go way up in value. Queen Jack, Ace 9, Ace 8, 10 9, Jack 9. These high card offsuit hands go way up in value the shallower you get. Because the stack to pot ratio gets lower and the threshold to stack off, you just can stack off for 20 big blinds when you make top pair or second pair. When you have 1,000 big blinds, if you get 1,000 big blinds with top pair, you're in big trouble. Okay, you probably don't have money to buy dinner later that night if you're putting in 1,000 big blinds with top pair. But if you put in 20 big blinds with top pair, that's great. So you want to adjust your preflop strategy to help you post flop. So the shorter you are, the more big offsuit cards are valuable. The deeper you are, the less valuable these hands come, and you want to play more of these connected suited cards. Any questions on like raise first in? Like, this is probably one of the more simpler things in poker of decisions we'll make. In cash games, early position, you want to be pretty tight, raise first in. Some of the mistakes you'll see is people raise too many small pocket pairs. They raise too many like ace jack, ace 10, ace 9, these big offsuit cards that don't play very well at the deep stack depths in early position. So, facing raise first in when you're not the big blind. Okay, this is probably the more complicated part of playing preflop, or the part that people make more mistakes because there's more decisions that can be made. We have more options. So, one of the first concepts, it came about in Limit Hold'em, and I can't remember if this is the exact name of it, but the gap concept. Okay, so what that concept said is you must continue with a tighter range than the opening range. So this gap concept means, let's say someone is raising under the gun with 15% of hands. Okay, they're playing a pretty snug range. They're raising 15% of hands. If you're next to act, you need to continue with a range much tighter than 15%, because one, you need to have a stronger range than your opponent, so you have to beat them, and two, you still have 7 other players left to act, and so that under the gun player, the first to act after the under the gun raise, might only call with or play 5% of hands. The next player might play 6 or 7% of hands. Maybe the button can play 10% of hands up against the early position ranger, because now they're guaranteed to have position. So it's important to recognize you play a tighter range than your opponent. Okay. And two, do you want to play calls? This is a very important question in defending versus a raise. Do you want to play calls, or do you want to play a 3-bet or fold strategy? And this is where the linear versus a polar strategy come into play. Linear versus polar. And this is a pretty important part of preflop and how to think about preflop strategies. Do you want to develop a linear strategy or a polar strategy? Okay. So linear versus polar. So linear strategies first. These are the easy ones. Okay, everyone kind of knows what a linear strategy is, even if they don't know what it means. They're built from the top down, so you're just playing the top cards. So think of a raise first in range. When you raise first in, you don't raise 7 deuce off and pocket aces. You just raise whatever the top 50% of hands are, because you're raising about 55% of hands from the button. You expand from a top down portion. You raise the best hands and not the worst hands. Okay. Linear ranges are similar to how raise first in ranges are built. Polar strategies become a little bit more complicated to execute. Polar strategies, you raise the best hands, you call your medium strength hands, and you raise your worst hands. So on the right here, we have an example of a polar strategy. Okay, in this example, we're looking at, I believe it is a cutoff raise and the button calls. Or sorry, this is the button strategy versus a cutoff raise in a tournament. And you notice here, we raise the best hands. Pocket 10s, pocket jacks, pocket queens, kings, aces, ace king, ace queen suited, ace jack suited. We raise these strong hands for value. We call the middling hand. And then we need to raise some bluffs. So anytime in poker that you have value hands, you need to have bluffs. Okay? If you only have value and no bluffs, you don't get any action with your value hands, in theory. If you're in a really good game, maybe you'll get some action. Now, we have the best hands that we raise, and then the worst hands. So when we say worst hands, we're not raising 7 deuce off, because we can't profitably play that here versus the button. It's the worst hands that we actually can play in the spot. A term you might have heard is VPIP, voluntarily put money in the pot. So of the hands that we decide are good enough to put money in the pot, we're just going to start raising the worst ones. So you see here, King 5 suited re-raises sometimes, King 6 suited re-raises sometimes, King 7 suited, Queen 8 suited, 9 7 suited, Ace 6 suited, Ace 10 off, Ace 9 off, Ace 8 off, Queen 10, Jack 10, Queen Jack. It really doesn't matter. Like, you don't have to get too complicated in this, but there's a couple of properties of all these hands. One, you can notice they're all on the fringe. They're the worst hands we're playing here. We're re-raising. And two, like a big concept here is like we can get better hands to fold. We don't re-raise King 9 or King 10 suited, because we fold out the worst kings, king 8, king 7, king 6, and we get called by the better kings, king 10, king jack, king queen. When we raise with king 7, we fold the openers king 8, their king 9 suited, their ace 7 offsuits. We can get some better hands to fold, king 10 offsuit to fold, maybe king jack offsuit folds. We get dominated hands to fold. That's an important property of choosing your 3-bet bluffs. So we 3-bet these weaker hands, 3-bet the strong hands, and then we're left with the middle. Okay, the middle hands are these middling strength hands we want to call. Okay, queen 10 suited, king jack suited, king 10 suited, ace 9 suited, ace 10 suited. All the middling strength hands. You guys have probably all seen this before. These hands just want to call. So we're raising the top, we're raising the bottom, and we're calling the middle. This is how a polar strategy works. Raise the best, call the medium, raise the worst. So, when to use linear or polar strategies, okay? So this is what's important. On shorter stacks, you want to use polar strategies, okay? The reason you want to use polar strategies on shorter stack depths, and on deeper stacks, you can use a more linear strategy. The reason is that when you have 40 big blinds and you 3-bet to, let's say they make it 2.5, and then you make it 7 big blinds, it's a very attractive price now for the person to just go all in for 40 big blinds. So you're going to get shoved on. The risk of going all in, of the player going all in and you not being able to call, goes up. So for example, if you have 40 big blinds, you don't want to 3-bet jack 10 suited, because if you make it 7 big blinds, they might go all in and now you have to fold jack 10 suited, a hand that flops very, very well. However, if you're deep stack, let's say you're 300 big blinds deep playing cash, you're playing 2-5 no limit, you have $1,500 in front of you. The cutoff makes it $15. You're on the button, you make it $45, and now the cutoff makes it $120. Well, you can just call with jack 10 suited because you're calling $80 now. The pot's going to be $240, and there's still $1,350 left to play. So with the deeper stacked you are, you can just call the 4-bet with these hands. So the risk of having to fold your equity is not that powerful. But when you're shorter stacked, having to fold these hands is just a disaster. That's why you want to develop a polarized range preflop. Does that make sense to everyone? So stack depth is very important whether you want to be linear or polar. Rake. Rake is very important on whether you want to be linear or polar. And this applies to these people that play live cash a lot. So when there's rake in the pot, you want to be more linear. And when there's no rake, you can be more polar. Okay? Why do you want to be more linear and 3-bet most all your hands and not call when there's rake involved? But when there's no rake, you can start calling and be more polarized. Why do you want to? So I say here, cash games with no ante, you want to be more linear and less polar. Why is that the case? So important, kind of, I remember playing cash coming up in LA. The comment was no flop, no drop. Okay, so when you 3-bet pre-flop, there's a chance your opponent's just going to fold. And when that happens, you just win the whole pot and no rake is taken. However, when you call, they take a rake out of the pot and you're going to lose 10-15% of that pot to the rake. Okay, especially at small stakes. The smaller the stakes, the larger the percentage of the pot the rake is. The more important rake is it's kind of backwards. The smaller stakes, the more rake you pay in terms of percentage of the pot, and at higher stakes, the less rake you pay. So when there's rake involved in these cash games that people are playing low stakes, 1-2 no limit, calling with speculative hands pre-flop becomes unprofitable because the rake eats too much into your profits. So what ends up happening is you don't want to call a lot in these small stakes cash games, and you can just play a 3-bet or fold strategy. And when that's the case, you can just play more linear. In tournaments, we don't have rake. Okay, we pay the rake before the tournament. It's like playing time games in cash games. If you're playing time games, then becoming more polarized makes sense because you can develop a calling range because you don't have to worry about rake anymore. So we're going to have a little quiz. I want some crowd participation here now. When to use a linear or a polarized strategy? Okay. First off, any questions on linear or polarized strategies so far? Nope, doesn't seem so. All right, so we'll move on. So when to use linear or polarized strategies? So number one, I'm going to give you some examples and I want some answers on what strategy you would use. So first, a loose recreational raises, and you know this player doesn't fold the 3-bets. So this is your player that's raising with 9-8 offsuit, and they're going to call your 3-bet with 9-8 offsuit. Do you want to be linear or do you want to be polarized? Meaning polarized, do you want to have calls and raise the top and bottom, or linear and just raise everything? Give you a couple seconds. So against this loose rec here, you want to be linear. Okay? How do you punish them? People, the common thing you say, oh, you don't like my games are so hard to beat because they don't fold pre-flop. They call your 3-bet with anything. Well, how do you punish someone that raises with 9-8 suited, 9-8 offsuit and calls your 3-bet? Raises with ace-7 offsuit and calls your 3-bet. You punish them by raising with 3-betting them with king queen, king jack, queen jack, ace-10, because now you're just going to flop dominated top pairs. If they have ace-7 and they're calling your 3-bet and you just start 3-betting, you don't want to 3-bet ace-4 because they're not folding ace-7. You just 3-bet all your really good hands and you 3-bet ace-10, ace-9, ace-jack, king queen, king jack, all these linear. You just 3-bet every hand you play and you play in position and you just are going to flop dominated hands against them more often. So when they have 9-8 and you have queen jack, you're going to flop dominating straight draws against them. You're going to win. That's how you win the most money against these players. You just start 3-betting a linear range against these types of players. You don't want to call with 6-4 suited. You want to 3-bet all the really good high card hands, or 3-bet everything like 10-9 suited. Next example, when you're 40 big blinds in a tournament versus an aggressive 4-better, do you want to be polarized or linear? So in this spot, you want to be polarized because the risk of the player moving all in for their 40 big blinds when you 3-bet and forcing you to fold your equity is too high. You want to 3-bet polarized. You 3-bet your king 4 suited, your king 5 suited, your king 6 suited, not your king 10 suited. The king 10 suited now you want to call and make sure you see the flop. Right? Cash game, 200 big blinds deep, the low jack versus an early position raiser. Here, you want to be linear. You just want to raise every hand you play, you just raise. Okay? So you play very tight and you only 3-bet. Because calling enables two things. One, when you call, you induce rake. So the pot is going to get raked now, and that's not good for you because now you're going to win less money. And two, you allow you're in too early of a position, and there's too many players left to act. Now they get a call behind, and you'll be playing multi-way pots out of position, which are very difficult to win. Right? So you want to 3-bet everything, deny equity to the players behind you, and avoid paying the rake if possible if the EP player folds. Or if they call, the pot is now bigger, so the rake is a less percentage of the pot. Next and final one is small blind versus button. A button raise, 150 big blinds deep in a cash game. Here, you want to be very linear from the small blind. You don't really want to call and allow the big blind to call, and now you're playing 3 ways out of position and you're squeezed in the middle. We call it sandwiched in the middle there. So in the small blind, when you call, you're allowing the big blind to call, and now you're sandwiched in between 2 players out of position. This is one of the most difficult spots in poker. So you're against a wide button open, you want to be very, very aggressive, 3-betting the small blind with a linear strategy. Just every hand you're going to play, just go ahead and 3-bet it. All right, another crowd participation. What is the most profitable position in poker? Is it the button? Is it under the gun? Is it the small blind? Is it the big blind? What is the most profitable position in poker? The most profitable position in poker is not the button. A lot of people think it's the button. You win the most money on the button. So the big blind is where you make the most money. Okay? The big blind is where you make the most money in poker. Okay? Now, you're going to lose money in the big blind because you pay the big blind every single hand, and sometimes you have to fold. So every time you fold, you start at -1 big blind every hand. However, the big blind is where you make the most money because you get so many profitable calls because of the great pot odds you get in the big blind. So in the big blind, you get great pot odds because of already having one big blind invested. So the most important position in all of poker is the big blind, not the button. Okay? The most important position in all of poker is learning how to play the big blind efficiently. So that leads to the next side. Defend your big blind. Okay? Learn how to play your big blind profitably. Learn how to play your big blind well. Okay? So what type of factors do we have when deciding do we want to call or fold when playing the big blind facing a raise? Okay, the raise size is probably the first and the most important part. What is the size of the raise? And a big mistake that I see a lot of people making is they defend the same range. Let's say you're playing 2-5 no limit. They defend the exact same range if the player makes it $15 or the player makes it $20. Rather, there's a very, very significant difference in the range of hands you defend if you're facing a $15 raise or a $20 raise. Okay, as a general rule, suited hands don't really care that much if it's $15 or $20. Okay, they're going to be pretty inelastic. They don't really care if it's 15 or 20. I'm not those good at those words. I think inelastic's the right one. Offsuit hands are going to be much tighter against the $20 bet than they are against the $15 bet. Okay, the $20 offsuit hands are going to defend much less versus 20 than 15. So, rule of thumb: be very sensitive to raise size with your offsuit hands, and with your suited hands, you don't have to be quite as sensitive. Okay. Actually, we'll go here. The next thing here would be the position of the raise. Okay, you're going to defend wider against a button raise. Why? You're going to be wider versus the button because it has a wider range, and all your hands have more equity. Versus the under the gun player, you're going to be much tighter from the big blind because all your hands now have less equity due to the tighter opening range from the under the gun player. The rake structure can have an impact. So the more rake, the higher the rake percentage, tighter you play from the big blind. The lower the rake, or if there's no rake, you can play much looser from the big blind. Similar to the rake structure, the ante size. The bigger the ante, the wider you play from the big blind. The smaller the ante, the tighter you can play from the big blind. Stack depth is a really important one. So if you're 200 big blinds deep, you're often going to fold hands like King 7 offsuit, for example. But if you're 15 big blinds deep, you're going to call with King 7 offsuit because King 7 offsuit is a hand that can flop strong top pairs, decent second pairs with the 7, and when you're 15 big blinds deep, you're happy stacking off with a single top pair hand. But when you're 200 big blinds deep, King 7 offsuit does a terrible job of making a hand that can ever put in a lot of money into the pot. So the deeper stacked you are, the more you want to be suited and connected. The shallower stacked you are, the more you can care about offsuit hands. Okay? And finally, something that a lot of people don't think about is the skill of the opponent. So the better the opponent you're up against that raise, the tighter you play from the big blind. The weaker the opponent that raise, the looser you can play from the big blind. So any charts that you look at online, if you're looking at the poker coaching charts, whatever charts you're looking at, those charts are based off of playing against a perfect computer. And the more mistakes your opponent makes, the more hands that you can profitably play. So the weaker your opponent, you play more hands. And the stronger your opponent, you play less hands. Okay, you can make tighter folds because they're going to make less mistakes post flop, and there's less money to be made. Second thing, defend your small blind. Okay, um, small blind's the second most important position in all of poker because again, you're getting great pot odds having already put in half a big blind in poker or in the small blind. So it's the second most profitable position. Again, like the big blind, you will lose money in the long run in the small blind. However, if you take away the sunk cost of putting in the small blind, you make more money in the small blind than you do on the button because there's no sunk cost playing the button. Um, you're getting great pot odds, and you get to play a lot of hands from the small blind. In tournaments, I often see players, they don't call enough from the small blind. So what I have on the right here is a strategy playing from the small blind versus a button raise. And in the small blind, you have antes. There's no rake because this is a tournament. And often I see the people folding hands like queen 6 suited, king 4 suited, king 3 suited, ace 8 off, ace 7 off, 10 9 off's in there, jack 10 off is there, king 9 off is in there, deuces, 5 4 6 5. There's a lot of weak hands you can play because of two things. One, you're very close to completing the action. You only have one other player that can squeeze or get you out of the pot, and it's not going to happen that often. And two, you're getting incredible pot odds because you already have a half a big blind in the pot. So there's a big difference having to call two big blinds because you already have a half a big blind in the pot versus calling 2.5 big blinds. Okay. Cash games, often a mistake that I see from players is they don't defend enough versus steals. So same thing in cash games. You really want to punish the wide button open, the wide cutoff open, and 3-bet a lot, and 3-bet very aggressively, and just steal those opens. You're getting a slightly better price on your 3-bet because you don't have to invest that extra half a big blind. It makes a difference. So you're going to play a lot of hands from the small blind, and people underestimate, and they end up playing way too tight out of the blinds, and it kills their win rates, and it kills their expected value because you're just getting great pot odds. The two most positions in poker: playing the big blind, playing the small blind. Maybe the small blind and the button you could say are both about the same, but the big blind is the most important position in all of poker. Learn how to play the big blind. If you're going to learn to play any position in poker, learn to play the big blind very, very well. So here I wanted to just show the difference in defending your big blind. So this is a big blind defense strategy in tournaments and cash games. So we've talked about rake. We've talked about how rake affects it and the antes. How there's no rake and no antes. And I just want to show how big of a difference this makes. So in tournaments, these are both versus a button raise. In a tournament format in the big blind, you're folding 16% of the time versus a button raise. This is with like 50 big blinds. Notice you just fold the complete junk. 7 deuce, 8 deuce, hands with like a deuce or a 3 or maybe a 4 in it. You're defending everything because you're getting such good pot odds and you're getting great pot odds. You don't have to pay any rake and often facing a smaller raise size. Okay. So you defend a lot. And this is versus a perfect playing person on the button. So you could argue even playing more hands. This is versus like probably a 2.3 or 2.5x raise versus even a smaller raise. You can play more hands, or against a weaker player you can play more hands. Compare that to the cash game. You're folding 61% of hands. So there's a massive difference in these pot odds. This is a 2.5x raise in the cash games. And look at how tight we're playing from the big blind. We're getting way less pot odds because there's not that one big blind ante in the pot. So the biggest mistake I see in cash games, or one of the biggest mistakes I see in cash games, especially live, everyone defends their big blind way too much. Okay? It's $15, $20. People are defending their big blind way too much offsuit garbage in their range because nowadays people dabble in tournaments, and in tournaments you get to defend so much from their big blind, and they don't make that adjustment when there's an ante in the pot or when there's rake taken from the pot. So when there's rake and ante, you can play much tighter, and look at all these folds. You're folding a big chunk of the suited hands, a massive chunk. You're folding ace 4, ace 3, ace deuce, ace 6. I imagine a huge, maybe like 90% of players at 1-2, 1-3, 2-5 are not folding ace 6 offsuit to a button raise for $15, and it's really not that close. and especially if they make it $20, which some people do. So cash games were much tighter defending because of the rake, because of the ante. Um, a few more preflop mechanics. Again, just to reiterate, deep stacked, suited, and a connectedness increase. So you're playing cash games. It's all about being able to flop a straight flush. If your hand can make a straight flush, it's a pretty good hand. Okay, so the deeper stacked you are, being suited and being connectedness are very important. Shallow stacked becomes a high card game. Okay, you want to just be able to make top pair. All right, so you have 30 big blinds, 40 big blinds in a tournament. If you're short stacking cash games, you want to be able to make top pair and get all the money in. So that's why in tournaments they end up being very ace-x heavy, very king-x heavy, and range advantage becomes a little bit more important. So you might have heard these terms, range advantage and nut advantage. So range advantage being mostly comes out a lot down to who has the most top pair, who has the most second pair, who flops the strongest pairs. That's like the game of tournaments. Okay, and that has to do a lot with the range advantage and equity. Cash games, the deeper you get, 100 big blinds, 200 big blinds, 500 big blinds, 1,000 big blinds. It all comes down to the nut advantage. Okay, the deeper you get, ingrain this. If you take one thing away from today, the deeper you get, the more the nut advantage matters. And it matters a little bit with sets, but it matters a lot with straights and flushes. How many straights can you have? How many flushes can you have? All right, and when you have all the straights and all the flushes in your range, you can play very, very, very aggressively with really, really big bets when you're super deep, and you want to be set yourself up for that. So you want to be very suited heavy when you continue, and very connected. All right. So hands like Jack 10 go way up in value because Jack 10, whenever it makes a straight, Jack 10, it's the nut straight. Queen Jack, whenever it makes a straight, it's going to be the nut straight. Ace 6 suited, whenever it makes a flush, it's the nut flush. So when you're 1,000 big blinds, it can get very, very expensive to make a 6 high flush with 6-4 suited. Okay? But when you're 1,000 big blinds deep, making the nut flush with ace 6 suited becomes massively profitable. Okay? That is it for slides for right now. Happy to answer any questions that are coming along. Any questions you guys have, I'm happy to answer. Don't be shy. Something I would say, like, how do we study preflop? So I think a good way to study preflop is drilling preflop ranges. I think it's a great way to warm up. Okay, so I think you want to study preflop. Like, to this day, if my warm up routine before I play is, say, 30 minutes that I'm warming up studying, I'll spend 10 minutes of it just doing preflop work. So raise first in is important, and then I'll do a lot of verse raise first in. So in tournaments, we're doing a lot of polarized raising, and so I'll do which hands do I want to play? Like call, fold, or raise this hand, call, fold, or raise this hand, and getting drilled and drilling those ranges on poker coaching. There's a under the tools section, there's a trainer you can use for preflop, and I think it's a great way to warm up for your session. That's one thing I don't think people do. This doesn't really have to do with preflop, but just like, poker players, I don't think poker's a sport. We're not athletes, but we are like mental athletes. And I think just like a professional athlete, like LeBron James, is warming up his body for an hour, 60 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is before the game. He's warming up his body so it's at peak function for the game. I think as a poker player, you need to warm up your brain for 30 to 40 minutes before you start playing. You want to get your mind into poker mode before you start playing. So whether that's reviewing hands, I like to drill. So I'll drill my preflop stuff basic mechanics. I like to drill basic preflop stuff, some c betting stuff. Um, get yourself thinking into poker mode, and that's, I think, in your warm up routine is a great way to, if you're working on raise first in, do some raise first in drilling. If you're working on playing more hands from your button, do verse raise first in when you're on the button. Defending versus a raise. That's how I think is a very, very good way to warm up for your sessions and continually to work on your preflop game. Captain, good question. What's the ideal 3-bet size if there's a raise and a caller? I don't think you need to go quite as big as people think when there's a raise and a caller. And the reason is that the caller's range is pretty capped. So when they call, they've kind of already told you, I don't have the top end of my range. I just have a middling strength hand, right? So I think the general kind of consensus, like you can go 3x like the original open plus like another, maybe when there's a caller you go 4x. So in a tournament, I'm a tournament specialist. If it goes like 2.3 big blinds and then someone calls 2.3 big blinds, in position I'll make it 7.5 or 8 big blinds. Often I see people making it 10 big blinds or 11 big blinds. When you're like really deep stack, that's fine, but I don't think you need to make it quite as big as everyone says, especially if it goes like raise under the gun for 2.5 big blinds, call, and people think they need to make it like 20 big blinds. I don't think you necessarily do, because every subsequent caller, their range is weaker and weaker and weaker. And you really don't care if they call now because their range is so weak post flop. So that third caller, you know they don't have a good hand because they would have squeezed themselves, right? So most likely they're going to fold to the same if you make it 12 or if you make it 20, because we know they don't have a really good hand anyways. So a general rule is like, when there's a raise and a call, I'd go like, you can go 4x the open, 3.5x times the open, I think is a good general rule to go from. But don't be scared that you have to go so big, but just remember the caller has already told you they don't have a strong hand, so you're not so worried about the caller, if that makes sense. And that's why you want to attack that very liberally, because the caller has already told you they don't have a great hand, so that's why you want to squeeze quite aggressively. Good question. Any other questions? Give you guys another 60 to 90 seconds if you want to ask questions. I'm all open. If it doesn't have to do a pre-flop, whatever. You guys, take advantage of it. I'm happy to answer questions. Great question, thanks. So in cash games, when there is an under the gun straddle, how does our strategy in the big blind change? Is it similar to when the small blind, when we sometimes have a calling range? So when we're the big blind, let's say we're playing 3-5 and we're the $5 blind and there's a $10 straddle. I would play it very similar to like you're the small blind. So I'd be doing like a lot of aggressive 3-betting and squeezing versus late position opens, and just be careful with calling too much, because you're going to so this is a cash game, so there's rake, and B, there's no antes. So in those situations, we're often encouraged to be more linear and just 3-bet everything that we choose to continue with. Okay, so we don't want to give the big blind a good price, the straddle a great price. We don't want to be playing out of position, squeezed in the middle. Okay, what I mean by being squeezed in the middle is, let's say you call the $5 blind, the button opens, you call in the $5 blind, and then the straddle calls. So now you're three ways. You're going to check, the straddle's going to check, and the button bets. This is where the sandwich happens. See, the straddle just checks everything. So you have no information on the straddle's hand on the flop, and you're in the middle. So the straddler could have flopped 2-pair, have something like you're squeezed in the middle because you have to worry about the straddle call still behind you. Whereas the straddler doesn't have to worry. They get information on you. The person in the straddle has what we call relative position. they're out of position to the button, which sucks. But they know the button's going to bet, and they get to see what you do. Right? So you're really constrained in that situation, and that's part of the reason why calling in those situations, it's better to be maybe a little tighter and just 3-bet everything is likely the better strategy when there's rake involved and when there's no antes involved. Great question. All right. If there's no other questions, I think we're going to wrap it up. I hope you guys all enjoyed it. I think this is where I'm supposed to say, everyone, I hope they like and subscribe to the channel. Jonathan, I saw popped in earlier. This is the kind of brand new content, just different channel brand with the My Poker Coaching now instead of just the Poker Coaching channel. So it's a different channel that they're developing. So like and subscribe would be helpful. And keep an eye out for more content. I will have another one of these in 2 weeks, I believe, and we will be talking about small stakes cash games and my best tips for beating small stakes cash games. So you guys that are in here that play like 1-3 and 2-5, next week we'll be talking a lot. And you know what? We're going to be talking about a lot of this stuff. Being suited, having the nuts. This is what we're going to be talking a lot of in 2 weeks' time. So keep an eye out for that. And thanks for the people that showed up live, the people that are watching this on recording. Thank you. And I will see everyone there.